As the 200th anniversary for the Battle of Waterloo approaches, I stand here by the Great Lion Mound, where the 75,000 fallen soldiers are remembered today for their bravery and courage on the 18th of June 1815. I'm here to investigate why the battle happened, how so many lives were lost on this fateful day, and how one man was able to shape the rest of Europe.
On one side was the Duke of Wellington. He was commanding coalition forces consisting of Great Britain, Hanover, Brunswick, Nassau, Prussia, and the Netherlands, whose numbers made up roughly 118,000. On the other side was Napoleon. He commanded the remains of the French armies from the Napoleonic Wars, which made up roughly 72,000. Waterloo is located 12 kilometers south of Belgium's capital, Brussels. However, in 1815, during the time of the battle, Belgium was not a sovereign state. The battle took place in the Netherlands. Waterloo was also dangerously close to other major battles of the Waterloo campaign, slightly west of Wavre, northwest of Quatre Bras, and north of Ligny. The Battle of Waterloo was seen as the battle to end the conflict in Europe. If Napoleon was defeated, it would have also marked an end to the French Revolution, which had begun in 1789. There is often much deliberation as to how the Battle of Waterloo was won. Most military history scholars place the determination of the battle on the two commanders, the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon Bonaparte.
Arthur Wellesley was born in 1769 into a wealthy family. He entered the British Army in 1787. In 1793 he purchased a commission to become a major and was later promoted to lieutenant colonel. He assisted in the Mysore campaign of 1799 in southern India, where he gained most of his well-deserved reputation. He also fought in the First Anglo-Maratha War, which included battles deemed more difficult than even Waterloo itself. He was eventually promoted to lieutenant general in 1808. Wellington had historically used the defensive line in most of his battles, which would become a vital factor later in Waterloo. Napoleon was born on the 15th of August, in the same year as the Duke of Wellington, 1769. Napoleon joined the French military and became a second lieutenant in the artillery under Louis XVI. His career, much like other famous dictators such as Stalin and Hitler, began after the French Revolution. His most famous battle in the lead up to Waterloo was versus the British in the French Revolutionary Wars. He defended the port of Toulon from invading British forces. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general after the battle. In 1799, he and others attempted a coup and promoted himself to general-in-chief, and eventually in 1814, he promoted himself to Emperor of France. Napoleon was now in complete control. Napoleon was very adept with his tactics. He worked easily with the resources provided to him, and often attempted to break up opposition forces, enabling him to eliminate them one by one. Napoleon's goal was always to defeat the enemy, and not to capture land. For example, at Waterloo, his main aim was to defeat Wellington and Blucher, not capture Brussels. In contrast to Wellington, Napoleon's single-favoured strategy was the offensive. He would thrive on attacking the enemy, and has been hailed as the best attacking commander there has ever been. He concentrated on attacking Wellington and not defending against Blucher. The most common weapon in the battle was the flintlock musket. As it was only soon after the useful developments of gunpowder, the muskets were extremely inaccurate, but still more effective than most hand-to-hand combat tools. The muskets had a short range, poor sight, bad recoil, no riflings, and an extremely low rate of fire compared to modern weaponry. The clouds of smoke after each shot also made visibility a major issue. It was almost impossible to see the enemy. Cannons were used by both belligerents to great effect in many places. However, logistical measures of transport were poor. Due to the torrential rain the previous night, the muddy ground caused difficulties for the horses transporting the cannon. They were the most frequently fired weapon on the battlefield, with both round and case shot, but with poor accuracy, they were mostly ineffective. I'm here in the middle of the battlefield, where communication would have been poor due to the lengthy delay by which orders had to undergo. Mounted couriers were frequently sent across the battlefield and injured along the way, limiting communication capability. Wellington knew this would be a major problem, so took up defensive positions along the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. The artillery could not reach the couriers, which would mostly be travelling to Blucher and the Prussian forces. The battle was one of many in the Waterloo campaign. Wellington and Blucher's forces were attempting to drive Napoleon back into France after his marauding campaign through Europe. Hence why Waterloo was to be Europe's decisive battle.
The campaign unofficially started on the 16th of June 1815 with the Battle of Quatre Bras. Napoleon's most trusted general, Ney, had found that the area of Quatre Bras had only been lightly held by Dutch divisions of Wellington's army. Ney fought a cautious battle, and eventually, after Wellington took over the Allied force, was forced to stand their ground. The Allies ceded the field to rendezvous at a favourable position by the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, where Wellington knew he would have the advantage on the ground. On the same day, about 7 miles southeast of Quatre Bras, was Ligny. French forces under Napoleon were able to defeat Prussian forces under Blucher here, using effective cavalry charges. The Prussian centre gave way within hours of the start of the battle. D'Erlon's first corps of the French forces were not at either battle due to lack of communicational capabilities. It is argued that if they had been at Quatre Bras to assist Ney, the Allies would have been too weak to fight the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon had forced Blucher's forces back to Wavre. The retreat of the Allies had not worked perfectly for Napoleon. He needed Blucher to be forced further east and Wellington further west back to their supply bases. As per his philosophy, he needed to defeat the forces individually after separating them. He knew facing both forces would mean a higher chance of defeat. The aforementioned Wavre had become the marshalling point for Blucher's army. On the 17th of June, the Prussian 1, 2 and 4 Corps decided to march towards Wellington's left flank in order to regroup to face Napoleon. 3 Corps was left to form a rearguard, which would become significant in facing Napoleon's forces at Ligny. On Wellington's retreat from Quatre Bras, he set up strategic placements at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte.
The night before the 18th of June 1815 had been torrential. Rain had engulfed the soon-to-be battlefield of Waterloo. As Napoleon rode into the area, his generals advised him that the logistical capabilities of his cannon and cavalry would be limited until the muddy ground was more fortified underfoot. The battlefield was extremely small, with a size at maximum of 4 by 4 kilometres. It was almost half the size of other significant battles throughout the Napoleonic Wars. The soldiers of both armies had been recruited only a few weeks prior to the battle. They all believed there was no chance of a battle that day. The cobblestone road running from Brussels was said to have dictated the battle's natural axis.
There were 2 distinct strongholds in the battlefield which had given either belligerent a significant advantage if occupied. The Allied forces controlled both prior to the battle. Hougoumont was located to Wellington's right flank, and La Haye-Sainte was located down the centre of the battlefield, slightly right of Wellington, down the road from Brussels. Other strongholds would also prove extremely significant. Frischemont was located to Wellington's left, as well as the small village of Papillote. The position of Wellington's army gave him a distinct advantage. They had been positioned on the reverse slope of the Mont Saint-Jean ridge. It had been previously scouted as a suitable defensive position, and it would enable Wellington cover from most cannon fire, as well as allowing him to use the element of surprise later in the battle. The prospect of Prussian support approaching from Wellington's left flank would also be of great help during the battle. However, his left flank was still open and vulnerable. The Allied army proposed to defend on an arc less than 2.5 miles long. This was extremely short in comparison to battles such as Austerlitz and Leipzig. Wellington's army would philosophically form lines to fight the French. These lines allowed 100% firepower at all times, assuming the enemy was either in front or behind the lines.
The position of Napoleon's army was invariably different. His headquarters was known as La Belle Alliance and stood approximately 1.6 kilometres away from Wellington's Tree Crossroads. His army was made up through conscription, but the army was still extremely loyal to Napoleon. Napoleon's army, as usual, was made up of long columns, which have a strong depth, but were weak in firepower due to the fact that only 2 lines could fire at one time. The Prussian army was stronger than it was in 1806, when it had been previously defeated by Napoleon's army. The ragtag army was made up through conscription, and only 7 out of 25 of the Prussian regiments had been present previous to 1815. Minor armies provided almost 2/3 of the troops under Wellington's control. These included the Dutch-Belgian Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Electorate of Hanover, and the 2 duchies of Brunswick and Nassau. All of the armies had been constituted or reconstructed very recently, so organisation was poor. Unaware of Wellington's troop deployment beyond the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, Napoleon rode out to scout the battlefield himself on the Allied position on the morning of the battle after hearing calls of a retreat. As he rode, French divisions cheered "Vive l'Empereur!" Napoleon decided to attack at noon.
The movement to set off the battle was at approximately 11:30 am. Napoleon launched a supposedly diversionary attack to Hougoumont. The Allied forces were ordered to take cover behind the Mont Saint-Jean ridge to protect them from cannon fire, and only one Dutch-Belgian brigade was left showing over the ridge.
The initial attacks on Hougoumont were intended to be diversionary. Napoleon sought to draw in Wellington's reserve forces in an attempt to weaken his centre. The reality, however, was that Hougoumont escalated into an all-day battle, which constantly drew in more and more French troops, but only a handful of Wellington's troops. Right here at the South Gate was where the conflict for Hougoumont started, with the initial diversionary attacks escalating to a second attack by Soy's 2nd Brigade of the 6th Division, managing a small breach on the south side. The 1st Brigade of the 6th Division was more successful on the north side, however, managing to break through the North Gate. In a frantic defence, a small party of officers and Corporal James Graham fought in a vicious melee to shut the gate, trapping all of the French soldiers inside. The 2nd Coldstream Guards arrived eventually to reinforce them, and fighting continued all day.
As Wellington predicted, Napoleon's cannons opened fire at around 1 p.m. at the British lines showing over the ridge. D'Erlon's first corps was ordered by Napoleon to move forward and capture Papelotte, currently under the control of Wellington. The artillery fire quickly relieved the Allied troops of Papelotte, and through heavy casualties, D'Erlon's men captured the area. Wellington ordered his men to move forward and engage the French before they could regroup into columns. Meanwhile, at Wavre, a battle was already also well underway. Napoleon had earlier sent Marshal Grouchy to harass the Prussians advancing from the east, to disallow a reformation of all four corps. At the same time, Napoleon intercepted a message from the Prussians to the Allies informing them of their location. They were said to be around St. Lambert, within 10 kilometers of the battlefield. Napoleon was forced to send Labou's infantry and a cavalry brigade to face the Prussians, whilst he concentrated on the battle against Wellington. Wellington's Papelotte counterattack proved to be ineffective, and Napoleon began to send waves of infantry to attack Wellington's centre, and it became more vulnerable. La Haye-Saint eventually fell to the French. Wellington sent his reserve troops from Picton's brigade to support the Allies, and they eventually retook La Haye-Saint. In an attempt to win the battle there and then through his attacking capabilities, Wellington then ordered Somerset and Ponsonby's cavalry brigades to charge the enemy lines. After grim fighting, the French front-line infantry was decimated, but the French cavalry brigades withered out most of the Allied cavalry into retreat. Wellington used his strategic prowess to withdraw his infantry beyond the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, whilst Bernhardt retook Papelotte. The French artillery continued firing in accordance with the Allies. Shortly after, around 3 p.m, Napoleon ordered Ney to recapture La Haye-Saint. On the assault forward, Ney noticed injured Allied soldiers retreating over the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, and ordered his cavalry to charge over. The French cavalry ceased fire, and Allied soldiers quickly formed infantry squares, an ancient technique used to deter horses using simple animal psychology. The cavalry charge proved extremely ineffective. In response, Wellington sent his reserve cavalry to the infantry squares to support the Allies. Eventually, Napoleon's cavalry was forced to retire after hours of bloody fighting. Meanwhile, Ney had recaptured La Haye-Saint, allowing the French cavalry to move up to a more apt firing position closer to the Allied front line. This forced Wellington to order his troops to retreat back over the ridge and take up defensive positions.
In the turning point of the battle, whilst both sides had already lost tens of thousands of men, Napoleon made the most important order of the battle. He sent a division of his Imperial Guard to halt the Prussian advance, and the remainder was to march up the Allied centre. The Imperial Guard had never before retreated or surrendered. They were Napoleon's elite troops, capable of more than every single infantry soldier individually. The Imperial Guard passing Hougoumont were halted by Allied infantry, but the other cadre, near La Haye-Saint, continued to march forward. As the Guard were approaching the ridge, The Allied troops ran over the ridge to surprise the Imperial Guard, killing or injuring nearly 80% of them with the first volley of fire. Due to previous fighting, the Allied front line was already broken, but the Imperial Guard were forced to retreat. Some formed squares to protect Napoleon's retreat from the Allied cavalry advances, demonstrating how loyal the Guard were to him.
The Prussians recaptured Plassenois and Papelotte as soon as they arrived. Wellington noticed their movements and swept down the ridge to join the advance on the French retreat. Fighting continued until around 9 p.m, when the Prussian cavalry was still pursuing the French.
Blucher met Wellington to the building to my left, La Belle Alliance, Napoleon's headquarters for the battle. Although Blucher spoke no English, they shared a drink together and agreed to name the Battle of Waterloo, after the village that Wellington had stayed at the night before, as was tradition.
Marshal Grouchy, who was previously sent to harass the Prussian III Corps on the advance from Wavre, had won the battle the day after Waterloo. They, however, were too weak to face the Allies, so also retreated back to Paris. Napoleon fled for France with some loyal troops from scattered divisions. He arrived on the 21st of June to a poor reception from the French people, and he had abdicated on the 22nd due to talks of a revolution. On the 8th of July, the previous monarch, Louis XVI, was restored to his previous position as king. On the 15th of the same month, Napoleon was captured and surrendered to the British ship HMS Bellerophon, and was exiled to the island of St. Helena later on in the year, on the 16th of October. The last Treaty of Paris was to be signed on the 20th of November, entitling all of the opposing belligerents to reparations from the Napoleonic Wars, and new borders for countries France had annexed. Wellington returned to Britain as a war hero in 1818. He was praised and given rewards and medals of the highest order. He became Prime Minister in 1828 and lived out the rest of his life in politics. Not one fact, movement, or order can be placed on why the Battle of Waterloo was won by Wellington. From the rain the day before, to the movement of Wellington's troops behind the ridge, the Allied victory came from many different sources. The victory would eventually shape the rest of Europe, dictate British politics, and revolutionise the infrastructure of the world for decades to come.